to be honest about the tariffs. The countries aren't paying for the tariffs. The American people are paying for the tariffs. Businesses like mine are paying that tax, and in my case, is 72.6%.
Imagine this: a chess game where every time the rules change, players are forced to find new allies or risk being knocked off the board. Sounds strange, but that's exactly what Canada and Mexico are doing, shifting their strategies to navigate the unpredictable tariff moves coming from Washington. Once, American-made auto parts powered not just cars, but entire communities, providing steady work for generations in places like Michigan and Ohio. But as Canada and Mexico warm up their trade ties, seeking partners beyond the US, the ground is shifting beneath those familiar assembly lines. This year alone, a 2% dip in US export demand to our neighbors could threaten over 50,000 manufacturing jobs, many held by middle-aged workers who've spent decades in the industry. For those families, a slowdown doesn't just mean numbers on a spreadsheet. It means empty shifts, tighter belts, and maybe a for sale sign in the yard. What once felt like a given American parts in every North American car is now uncertain. The question is no longer just about business. It's about what the next generation of workers will find waiting for them, and whether Main Street can keep its doors open when the world's trade winds change. If you've noticed your grocery bill creeping up, you're not alone. In June, consumer prices climbed another 2.7%, the steepest jump since February, and a trip to the supermarket feels different now for millions of American families, especially those in their 40s and 50s trying to balance work, kids, and aging parents. Blame it on new tariffs. Staples like bread, milk, eggs, and cooking oil all cost more. Analysts say that if this keeps up, a family of four could spend an extra $110 each month on basics within the next 3 months. For retirees and folks on fixed incomes, it's a hard squeeze sometimes, meaning fewer fresh vegetables, or the tough choice between stocking the fridge and dipping into savings. Groceries used to be one thing you could count on. Now, with each price tag, there's a nagging worry. How much further can a paycheck stretch? And what will families have to give up next? Think about all the electronics, TVs, laptops, kitchen gadgets that fill American homes. Behind each one is a network of contracts and workers, many in their prime earning years, keeping the wheels of export turning. But this year, as Canada boosts exports to the EU, ASEAN, and Australia, the US share of Canadian exports slid from 78% to just 68% in a single year. If the shift sticks, at least 30,000 export-related jobs could vanish by year's end, hitting states like Michigan, Ohio, and Texas the hardest. For the workers who build and ship these electronics, the impact isn't abstract. It means fewer contracts, thinner paychecks, and in some towns, an uneasy sense that opportunity is moving elsewhere. When supply chains reroute, it's not just products that disappear, it's a whole way of life that gets harder to replace. There's something about a cup of coffee that anchors the American morning, especially for working families hustling to get out the door. But lately, that simple comfort is getting pricier, thanks to the latest Trump tariffs. The government took in $64 billion this past quarter. But the flip side is clear at the register. Prices for coffee, appliances, and clothing have all jumped. Inflation is still biting. And for many, the monthly budget feels tighter than ever. Over the next 4 months, U.S. households are projected to shell out an extra $220 just to keep up with living costs without seeing a bump in their wages. It makes you wonder, how long can families keep stretching their dollars? And is the morning coffee going to become another small luxury that's just out of reach? While the United States remains the world's leading superpower, a new strategic alliance between Canada and the European Union is drawing attention. Could this bold step reshape the future of global cooperation and leave Washington on the outside, looking in? On June 23, 2025, in Brussels, Canada and the European Union signed their first ever Security and Defense Agreement, a milestone marking the EU's first such pact with a nation from the Americas. The agreement covers crisis management, cyber defense, maritime and space security, arms control, and continued military support for Ukraine. The deal grants Canada access to SAFE, the EU's €150 billion approx 172 billion US dollars, Joint Defense Procurement Program. This opens the door for Canadian defense firms to secure low-interest financing for equipment upgrades, potentially creating thousands of jobs, particularly in the heavy industry and cybersecurity. At the same time, it could reduce order volumes for U.S. defense contractors, potentially impacting workers in states with major arms manufacturing facilities. Canada's deepening ties with Europe, beyond traditional U.S.-led structures, signal a shift toward a more multipolar Western alliance. According to officials, the EU may extend invitations to other North American partners, such as Mexico or Chile, by the end of 2025. Canada is also expected to increase purchases of European radar and air defense systems. In response, the U.S. may roll out an expanded security partnership, offering cyber defense tech and space intelligence sharing, as a way to reinforce bilateral security cooperation with Canada. On July 4, 2025, President Donald Trump revealed he had signed and delivered 12 formal letters to key U.S. trade partners. These letters outline non-negotiable tariff levels, take-it-or-leave-it terms, that will be enforced unless agreements are reached. A base 10% tariff, first announced in April, will be reinstated on July 9th, with some new rates rising to as high as 70% by August 1st, 2025. To date, only the United Kingdom and Vietnam have finalized deals. The UK secured tariff relief on automobiles and aerospace goods, while Vietnam agreed to a 20% tariff on most exports and 40% on re-exported or transshipped goods. This direct letter diplomacy sidesteps long-winded negotiations, favoring quick decision-making, but places significant pressure on governments to respond swiftly. Analysts expect bilateral talks with Japan, the European Union, and other major economies to begin in mid-July, aiming to avoid the harshest penalties and prevent major supply chain disruptions. Several nations may challenge the tariffs through the WTO or retaliate with duties on American goods. The EU is reportedly considering targeting U.S. agricultural and automotive exports, while China could expand its presence in Asia-Pacific markets by offering alternative supply channels. If the full 70% tariffs are enacted, imported car prices in the U.S. could rise by 10 to 15% in Q3 and Q4 of 2018-2025. Pharmaceuticals and electronics, especially components for consumer tech, may also face mild price hikes due to supply cost increases. For older adults and lower-income households, groups that spend a larger portion of their income on essential goods like food and healthcare, these changes could be especially noticeable. Experts estimate that real inflation may increase by 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points in the second half of 2025. Alongside the June 23rd Security Pact, Canada and the EU opened talks for their first-ever digital agreement, aiming to align data protection, digital signatures, anti-spam rules, and AI governance standards. Negotiations are expected to conclude by late 2025, followed by ratification in the European Parliament and Canadian Parliament. A mutual equivalence review mechanism would allow for seamless data transfers. Tech giants like Google, Meta, and Amazon may, by mid-2026, be required to comply with both US and Canada-EU standards, leading to increased transparency in advertising and AI practices. The US may counter with a new Privacy Shield 2.0 or negotiate a Canada-specific Data Governance Act to maintain digital leadership. For consumers, the deal would strengthen rights to access, correct, or delete personal data. Canada's cybersecurity sector could gain 5,000 to 7,000 jobs, and devices certified under the EU-Canada standard may become more competitively priced. By Q1 2026, both sides are expected to establish a joint digital partnership council to oversee implementation and expand cooperation into areas such as blockchain and the Internet of Things. Over the past several years, America First trade and security policies, combined with withdrawal from multilateral agreements, have pushed allies like Canada and the EU to explore closer bilateral cooperation. This trend is now materializing as autonomous partnerships, creating a new Western order that is less centered on U.S. leadership. This shift reflects more than policy differences. It signals a change in strategic trust. Countries such as Norway and Turkey, both NATO members, may soon join pan-European security initiatives that reduce reliance on Washington. To adapt, the U.S. could propose a Freedom Partnership Forum focused on cybersecurity, technological collaboration, and supply chain resilience. Such a platform might attract like-minded nations and restore some of the strategic unity that has eroded in recent years. However, in the short term, the U.S. could see a decline of 2 to 3% in agricultural and light industrial exports by 2026, impacting farmers and factory workers, particularly in the Midwest. Meanwhile, the cost of adopting secure digital tools may rise, and the Federal Reserve could maintain elevated interest rates to contain inflation, affecting mortgages, loans, and daily expenses. Ultimately, the future of U.S. leadership will depend on its ability to offer inclusive, transparent, and credible alternatives. Without them, the new alliance structures forming between Canada, Europe, and potentially other partners may evolve further without waiting for Washington's approval. Canada has quietly passed 7 new laws with major economic implications, including a 72-hour retaliatory tariff trigger mechanism. How might Washington respond? And what challenges lie ahead for the United States? Within just 6 weeks, the Canadian Parliament has approved 7 new laws covering a wide range of areas, from digital platform taxes and food import bans to electricity export controls and travel advisories that directly affect U.S.-Canada trade. Each law has formal legal standing and goes beyond diplomatic signaling. Most notably, a provision allows Canada to impose retaliatory tariffs within 72 hours, meaning U.S. goods could face immediate trade countermeasures that impact the cross-border supply chain. These moves could place considerable pressure on U.S. companies, from tech giants to small farms, triggering the need for export strategy revisions and new risk mitigation plans. Residents in border states, such as Michigan and New York, may soon see higher prices for goods and a sharp drop in tourism activity. Several U.S. states that rely on trade and tourism with Canada are already seeing tangible economic effects. Florida, for example, reported a 35% drop in Canadian tourists in May 2025, a major setback for cities like Orlando, where Canadian spending plays a large role in hospitality and entertainment. In addition, citrus and agricultural exports from Florida are now facing tighter inspections and increased rejections at Canadian customs. In Michigan, cross-border traffic has declined by 11 to 18%, particularly for private vehicles. This is hitting local towns that depend on daily trade, travel, and light freight transport. In Texas, the fallout is even more visible. The state has lost tens of millions of dollars in energy contracts. While exports of beef, citrus, and cotton have been delayed or halted under new Canadian trade standards, tourism from Canada to Texas is also down by more than 35%, significantly affecting restaurants, hotels, and sports-related services. For residents in these states, this translates into reduced household income, rising local prices, and increased pressure on employment in service sectors. Farmers and small exporters face difficulty accessing alternative markets, especially with rising inventories and limited time to redirect perishable goods. In the past 6 months, Canada's new legal and trade measures have cost the U.S. economy more than $12 billion in affected states. These losses stem not only from reduced exports, but also from disrupted supply chains, lower freight volumes, and declining service revenues. One particularly notable figure: cross-border commercial truck traffic has dropped by 37%, disrupting goods distribution raising logistics costs and causing canceled shipments. Meanwhile, thousands of tons of agricultural goods, including meat, soybeans, and corn, in states like Iowa, have been rejected or left in storage after failing to meet Canada's revised import criteria. For businesses, this means rising storage costs, missed sales, and limited growth. For consumers, especially in food-related sectors, prices may climb as oversupplied domestic goods struggle to reach global markets. Meanwhile, workers in agriculture, food processing, and logistics face reduced hours or temporary layoffs. 70%. That's the maximum tariff President Donald Trump has threatened to impose on imports from 14 countries starting August 1st. Is this the foundation of a new economic fortress, or the first crack at America's place in global trade? President Trump has issued what many are calling a global trade ultimatum. 14 countries have been warned. Sign bilateral trade agreements with the U.S. by August 1st, or face import tariffs ranging from 25% to 70%. So-called tariff letters were sent out in early July, stating bluntly, "Agree to our terms," or face severe tariffs. This move, part of Trump's America First economic doctrine, could lead to immediate consequences for American consumers. Without new agreements, prices for everyday goods, from electronics to food, medicine, and spare parts, may rise sharply in August. Retirees and middle-income workers, who rely heavily on these essentials, are likely to be hit the hardest. Among the targeted countries, Japan and South Korea stand out. President Trump has confirmed a blanket 25% tariff on all imports from both nations, effective August 1st. That includes vehicles, auto parts, electronics, and high-end consumer goods. Both Tokyo and Seoul are scrambling to negotiate exemptions, but so far, no agreement. For American households, the impact could be felt in rising costs: car repairs, electronics, and household appliances. Older citizens relying on medical devices or home technology, they'll likely see their monthly expenses climb. Markets responded swiftly on and negatively to the tariff announcement. The Dow Jones dropped 0.94%. The S&P 500 fell 0.79%, and the Nasdaq lost 0.91%. Shares in the automotive, retail, and tech sectors led the decline. Tesla, for instance, plunged 6.8%, driven by rising production costs and export risks. For Americans with retirement funds, stock portfolios, or savings tied to these sectors, this means immediate losses. And if major companies start pulling back on investment, job cuts could follow in the coming months. As of July 7th, only 3 nations, the United Kingdom, Vietnam, and the United Arab Emirates, have reached trade agreements with the U.S. key partners like the EU, Japan, South Korea, and Canada, still unsigned. In response, Canada is now pursuing independent trade deals with Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, ASEAN, the EU, and BRICS are reportedly exploring new trade blocs, independent of U.S. influence. If this trend continues, the U.S. could lose significant export market share. That would put millions of jobs at risk in manufacturing, agriculture, and logistics, especially across key industrial states. American consumers, too, may find fewer choices on store shelves and face consistently higher prices.
We've seen this game before where there's a tariff announcement, it gets moved back, especially for Canada, because Canada still needs to have this negotiation with the US and Mexico about updating the USMCA. So there's kind of an open question, will this tariff go into place before then? Will it just be used as a negotiating tactic as they continue speaking?
No grand announcement, no prior warning, just a sudden new policy. And the gears of an entire industry began to grind. Supply chains that once flowed smoothly across the border came to a halt. Factories were forced to pause operations. Thousands of workers quietly stepped off the production line. What's happening between these two close allies? Behind the dry statistics are countless hidden consequences. Watch the full video to uncover the secrets behind the US-Canada trade tensions. Starting March 2025, the US will impose a 25% tariff on cars imported from Canada, excluding certain domestically made components. This disrupts a deeply integrated supply chain, where parts often cross the border 6 to 7 times before assembly. The Windsor plant in Ontario has already shut down temporarily, affecting 3,500 jobs and halting new investments, per CBC News. The impact is rippling through U.S. communities.
We are very worried.
Factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana face growing supply bottlenecks, with new vehicle prices projected to rise at least 8% this year, according to Kelley Blue Book. If the tariff remains, over 25,000 U.S. auto jobs could be at risk within 12 months. In April 2025, Canadian return visits to the U.S. fell 35% by car and 14% by AIR compared to April 2024, according to Statistics Canada. This decline is already impacting hospitality and travel sectors on both sides of the border.
We're going to feel a big impact in our pocket end of the season if they don't show up this year.
U.S. wine exports to Canada plunged 93% in April alone, heavily affecting California's premium vineyards. Canadian consumers are increasingly embracing the Buy Canada movement, avoiding U.S. wine, beef, and agricultural goods. For American small businesses, especially in tourist hubs and rural farming areas, this trend brings serious challenges. With fewer Canadian visitors and shrinking exports, many local shops and farms are seeing sharp sales declines. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce projects a $2 billion loss in tourism and agricultural exports in 2025, threatening up to 50,000 seasonal jobs. A new round of liberation tariffs imposes a 25% levy on Canadian steel and 10% on energy imports. The state government of Massachusetts has projected that New England households could collectively pay an extra $2.5 billion in heating costs in the next few years. Small American businesses now face surging costs for raw materials, food, healthcare supplies, and logistics. The impact hits hardest at home, as heating and utility bills soar. Middle-class families, retirees, and those relying on fixed incomes are struggling to keep up. The Bureau of Labor Statistics forecasts an average 12% increase in household energy bills this winter, with nearly 1.5 million Americans at risk of falling behind on payments. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has finalized a trade and defense pact with the EU covering nuclear energy, rare earths, and digital trade. Canada plans to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP over the next decade, investing in ports and reducing reliance on US and Chinese supply chains under NATO's revised targets. Canada and allies aim to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense and 1.5% on critical infrastructure and cyber defense by 2035. This shift could alter America's economic footing. As Canada pivots toward Europe, U.S. manufacturers risk losing contracts, and export-reliant industries may face layoffs. Analysts estimate up to 75,000 U.S. jobs could be lost if Canadian trade increasingly favors the EU.
He said if Canada works with the U.S. to stop the flow of fentanyl, he might consider adjusting the tariffs.
Former President Trump has threatened a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian imports, and Canada is already preparing strong countermeasures.
Possibly millions of Americans that are going to be terminated because of this trade deal.
Could these trade tensions reshape North America's economic future? President Donald Trump recently announced plans to impose a 35% tariff on selected Canadian imports. during a speech in Ohio, citing what he calls unfair trade practices. Trump accused Canada of exploiting the U.S. and hinted at a possible U.S. withdrawal from the USMCA agreement if Ottawa refuses to compromise. This move follows a series of tariff increases on steel and aluminum, and previous threats to U.S.-Canada agricultural trade. According to the Associated Press, in 2023, the U.S. imported nearly $90 billion in goods from Canada, making it the U.S.'s largest trading partner. If the proposed tariffs take effect, everyday Americans could soon face sharply higher prices on Canadian goods, such as food, lumber, minerals, electricity, and beef retirees, blue-collar workers, and residents in agricultural states may feel the strain most acutely. For example, U.S. food prices could rise by up to 8% for items sourced from Canada, and certain regions, particularly in the Midwest, would bear the brunt of these increases. Forecasts suggest nearly 12 million Americans could see higher household expenses by year's end if tariffs are enacted. Canada's government swiftly responded, vowing to defend its domestic market and supply chains. Officials warned that any 35% tariff from the U.S. would trigger immediate countermeasures, such as import restrictions, energy contract cancellations, and reduced investment in U.S. markets. Prime Minister Mark Carney stated Canada will not be threatened and is accelerating trade deals with the EU and Asia to reduce reliance on U.S. commerce, according to Reuters. Canada's two-way trade with the EU grew by 17%. Last year, export-driven industries such as U.S. auto, agriculture, and industrial equipment could lose market share in Canada, threatening millions of American jobs in states like Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, and Texas, where up to 1.2 million workers depend on exports. Data show Canada's jobless rate fell to 6.9% in June, with 59,000 new jobs added, particularly in healthcare, construction, and education, marking the first employment rise in 5 months. As American workers contend with layoffs tied to supply chain disruption and rising input costs, Canada is seeing a surge in global orders and new employment opportunities. This contrast underscores a bitter reality for the U.S. labor force. If the trend continues, projections indicate U.S. unemployment in affected sectors could rise by 1.2 million in the next 6 months, while Canada could add an additional 150,000 jobs in trade-sensitive industries. Canada's central bank holds rates steady, buoyed by its stable economy, while Ottawa invests heavily in retraining workers for green tech and renewable energy. It is actively pursuing new export agreements amid U.S.-China and U.S.-EU tensions, with Canada focused on future-oriented growth and U.S. locked in protectionist tactics. A widening competitive gap may emerge. Analysts warn that if the U.S. doesn't pivot, it could miss out on up to $50 billion in export opportunities over 5 years.